Hey everyone, this is Teresa from Base 10 Montessori, and today I wanted to give you a video on the 11 biggest mistakes that you can make in the practical life area and how to avoid them. Now, the previous week I talked about the 10 ways to make your practical life area successful, and if that's not going well, let's take a look at what might be going wrong in your practical life area. So the first thing I would say is the environment doesn't appeal to the child. That's one huge mistake that a lot of teachers make. So you have to keep in mind the practical life area is meant to be beautiful. Think about beauty, aesthetics, natural colors, not the primary colors. There'll be opportunities to introduce primary colors, secondary colors, and tertiary colors within the Montessori environment. So make sure that you're really focusing on what's natural, what's beautiful, what's the aesthetic shape of the materials that might appeal to a child. And I remember one of my trainers saying, I had this work on the shelf as the spooning work and nobody was using it. And then I realized once I changed it out for something a little bit more beautiful, a little more fragile, the children just popped right to it. So if the children aren't using the materials, try switching it out for something a little different, maybe something a little more visually appealing. I know when children are young, they're going to break these things, right? And so you don't want to spend a ton of money on it. But part of Montessori is the control of error. And the control of error often happens when we break something, right? That's the feedback that something didn't go right. And we have to also include the lesson of how to clean things up when it doesn't go well. So just remember, things are going to get broken. It's hard to spend that extra money, but Goodwill, thrift stores, all of them, you can usually find some beautiful things for a fairly cheap price. So just keep your eye out. Go yard sailing, all of that stuff. Keep your eye out for affordable things that are natural and beautiful so that the child is more attracted to the materials. So the other thing in the environment is that it should be culturally representative. And by that, I mean, this is the place where the child adapts, right? So if you're doing a lot of things in the room that doesn't match up with their culture, that might be an issue. So if most of the children in the room are from the United States and you have the room set up for the United States, and you get a child from a different country in there, it might be a difficult transition because it's not as familiar, right? So maybe adding in some materials that might be familiar to a certain child that might be having a hard time adapting, that might be one thing you can do. Or there might be the reverse. What if you're over in a different country and you're setting up your room as if it was the United States? This probably isn't going to help the children adapt either. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So you want to start with what's familiar and then introduce different things, different cultures, different materials later when the child has already adapted to the environment. So just remember to start with that familiarity and then move to what's different. And of course, the interests should be varied in the practical life area because some children are going to be interested in baking, some children are going to be interested in woodworking, and some children are going to be interested in sewing, some children are going to be interested in gardening. These are all things you can do in the practical life area as well as all your art lessons. So just keep in mind that there should be a wide variety of appeal. This is really the place to introduce things that aren't in your album. So make sure to go outside of your album for the practical life area. And if you're not trained and you don't have an album, this is really your opportunity to be a little more creative. So the works should be rotated and they should be changed out. And you probably should reflect seasonal changes within your room. So this is the part of your room where you get to be a little more thematic. And if you're trained in early childhood, this should be familiar because we do this in early childhood a lot. So that's my first degree was in early childhood. I worked in childcare. So this part of the environment is what is more familiar to me before I got into Montessori. And second, is there too much plastic in your classroom? So I have this picture to the right that's from montessoriguide.org. It's one of their videos. And just take a look at that classroom real quick and kind of look through it, see, okay, how much plastic is in there, do you think? And not a lot. We try not to use too much plastic. I often use plastic for really more for just art materials, such as painting or science experiments sometimes have plastic with it. But I really try to limit it because the Montessori environment is supposed to be breakable. It's supposed to be beautiful. It's supposed to have fragility to it. It's supposed to have a control of error. And like I said before, when things break, that's a control of error. We don't want things to break. That's not our intention. But we also understand that that's feedback to the child that I have to be that I have to be careful. And when the child understands that, they behave differently, right? So if you're constantly giving your child plastic things to hold, plastic things to use, are they as careful as if you give them something fragile? You think, oh, well, that is something you're going to have to learn about with your body. So I think a lot of what we're seeing nowadays is children aren't being very careful with their bodies because they haven't needed to be. Everything is plastic. So I want you to go back to using some things that are beautiful and fragile and understand also what your response is going to be when it does break. So that's something you have to have a plan for. It's not pleasant when it breaks. It's not pleasant for the adult. It's not pleasant for the child. So you have to have your response planned out in advance and make sure that you have a lesson plan in mind for when things break, because that is a control of error, but it also makes the room more beautiful. And as Maria Montessori says in The Absorbent Mind so many times, that the environment has to have an attraction for the child. And I think about when I used to work at Head Start. I actually worked at Head Start. I was subbing at Head Start the same time I started in a Montessori environment, and it was just 180 out from each other. The Head Start environment, loud, primary colors with everything just shoved in there, posters all over the wall. And then I'd go to the Montessori environment and I would see these beautiful setups of wooden tables and individualized works and glass plates and little pictures and tea sets and beautiful art hung up on the wall. Sometimes the art is made by a local artist and it's displayed on the wall. So it's a very different concept, and I think that this is really important that, when you're talking about the environment, the child has to have an attraction to the environment, because if they're repulsed by their environment, there's going to be some deviations there. And we talked a little bit about that in the last video of The Absorbent Mind. I think that was chapter 8 of The Absorbent Mind that we talked a little bit about that. But we'll get more into the deviations as we go along in the Absorbent Mind book. So just keep that in mind, that the materials in the Montessori classroom, especially in the practical life area, should be really more of wood, glass, porcelain, metal. And if you're going to do plastic, yes, we use plastic. It does happen, but we really try to limit it. One, because it's not very beautiful, and two, because it doesn't have much control of error for the child. Like I said, this picture comes from montessori-guide.org. It's a wonderful resource. They have tons of videos on there. So if you're more interested on that, I'll make sure to drop a link down below so that you can click on it and explore their website, because it's a really, really wonderful website for some resources. Another mistake in the practical life area is the lack of grace and courtesy. This could be a problem in your practical life area. Are the children practicing their grace and courtesy skills? Are they learning how to tuck in a chair? Are they learning how to say, "Excuse me, may I pass by?" Are they learning how to say, "This is my work, please go find your own work. I'm trying to concentrate"? Are they learning to serve each other and not just say, "Hey, I just made a bunch of bread and I'm going to eat it all myself"? No, we want to serve each other. Do the children serve others after baking or making tea and coffee? If they're doing tea, like one of my first classrooms I worked in, the older child would invite a younger child or another child for having tea, and the older child would set up the table, make sure there's beautiful linens on there, set up the tea set, allow the child to select their tea. They would make the tea for them, and then they would have a little tea party, and it was beautiful, right? And the other child is serving another child, or they could be going to serve an adult. A lot of times they loved going to the head of school and say, "Can I make you a cup of coffee?" So there are different ways to serve the people in the community. And part of the practical life area, it's a great time for the older children to help the younger children. The children should not be just dependent on the adult in the classroom. The older children really should be there. And that 3-hour work cycle at the beginning of the day really should be where the older children are helping the younger children. And then when you're in the afternoon, that's when you really focus on your lessons for those older children while the other children are napping or going home. So the older children really need to be helping the younger children in the morning. And also remember, when it comes to practical life, the older children should be doing a little more collaborative work. Not a ton, but you're going to have those children who are starting to tip over into the second plane of development. And that second plane of development is very social. You'll start seeing that social element really come into play about the age of 4, right? But it's not very purposeful at 4. And so you still really want to limit it to, I don't know if I really want you and this other child working together, because it just ends up kind of becoming messy fun and not purposeful. But when they get into being more 5 to 6 years old, that's when that collaboration really starts coming together. And again, you still have to be particular and think, is this a good combination to be working together? I'll have to think about that. Let's show me that you can work together. But at the same time, remember, those older children are about to tip over into that second plane of development, and some will already, especially if you have some children who have been held back and aren't going into the first grade classroom, and they did get held back for another year. They may already be in the second plane, and then you have to think that those children need to have more group lessons, some more collaborative activities to do with each other. That's just the stage of development that they're in. So make sure to keep that in mind when it comes to the grace and courtesy and how children are interacting in your classroom, especially in the practical life area. And the other thing to consider is the amount of lessons. So this is one that's hard to get right, especially if you're a beginning teacher or if you're a teacher that's just really, really, really exhausted, right? It's hard to keep track of, do I have enough lessons? Do I have too many lessons? And so some of the things you'll see when you have children who've not had enough lessons is they might seem bored. They might get out of work and not really do anything with it. And they're like, meh. And they don't really have an interest in the work, right? They just have the work out to have a work in front of them so that you don't harass them over getting a work, right? And that's not what we want to see. We want to see children repeating the lessons, but we want to see activity with the lessons. If they're just getting out of a work, sitting down with it, and then putting it back on the shelf, which I see a lot, that's really, if you take some time to observe, you're going to see this behavior in children who have not had enough lessons or enough lessons that are interesting to them or challenging to them. So really take time to observe what they're doing with the work and observe that if they've had mastery over the skill. If you're like, well, this child I know has mastery over this skill, why am I still referring them back to this work? Have I offered every single extension to this work? So that's something to keep in mind. And then if you've had too many lessons, you have a different problem. Does the child need to master a skill before moving to a new lesson? Does the child have control over their body to accomplish this lesson? And if they don't, what do you need to do? Do you need to create smaller steps? Do you need to pull back just a little bit instead of doing table scrubbing like the child really wants to do? Maybe the child needs to work on table wiping, just wiping with a sponge, right? Maybe they need to work on crumbing, sweeping up the crumbs. Do they need some shorter lessons? Do they need transitional lessons? So if you have a really, really big lesson, like let's say the child really, really wants to bake, and they haven't gone through all the steps yet for learning how to bake, break that up. Say, okay, well, let's break this lesson up into smaller steps of learning how to measure. What would it look like just to learn how to use a tablespoon? Just to learn just how to use a measuring cup? What would it look like for woodworking, just to learn the skill of using a handsaw on a piece of cardboard, right? Just that. We're not making anything. We're breaking it down into small steps. What are we going to do with sewing? Are we going to let them sew a purse, let them sew a bracelet, do embroidery, or do we need to go back and focus on going from one hole to the next without the needle and thread getting all tied up, right? So you might have to take a few steps back, create some lessons that go in between lessons so that the child can transition a little bit better. And don't forget that if you give too many lessons, you're not giving the child motivation to to perfect themselves. And what I mean by that is that sometimes seeing what those 30-year children are doing, what the older children are doing, will be the motivation for the child to go back and say, okay, well, I really want to bake bread. So I really have to master how to use that tablespoon, how to measure a cup, how to scrub a table, how to do dishes. These are all things that I say, well, have you had a lesson on this, this, and this, and this? And if you have, let me see. I need to see that you're working on that. And I need to see that you can do all those lessons before I offer you the baking bread lesson. And when the child goes back, and sometimes I have a child that goes back and does the lesson once and say, okay, am I ready? I'm like, no. You need to go back and actually master that skill. You need to practice at it. So sometimes when I say that, they think, okay, I need just to do it once and then I can go and have the lesson on something else. No, I need to see the mastery over the skill. So just remember that when the child sees older children doing these big works, that gives the younger child motivation to practice the smaller works. And sometimes you need that. Sometimes you need those peer examples to motivate the child. Another mistake is not enough structure. So if you are too lenient with the behavior in the classroom, things are going to happen that's going to create a lot of chaos. And my question is, how many things in your classroom are getting broken? Is there too much mess? Not enough order? And remember, order is a really important word here because the child is going through a sensitive period for order. And so order needs to be a real important idea in these works. Order. It's a sensitive period. It's a need that the child has. The child is trying to put everything in their life into order. So some of the things you need to think about is, are there too many children with one material? So like I said, older children, they can kind of collaborate a little bit, but when it comes to the younger children, unless you have an older child helping the younger child out, giving them a lesson, giving them some assistance, they really should be individualized one-on-one works. That's going to be a majority of your works, particularly in the practical life area, which is an area where the child comes to adapt to the environment and give back to the community. The other thing to look at is not enough small or logical steps. So do you have enough structure in the lesson presentations in your classroom? Are the steps well thought out? Are they logical? Are they small? Are you doing one mastery of skill at a time? Or are you trying to combine too many skills in one lesson? The other thing to think about is there enough movement? Are you offering enough movement with this? If you're not allowing the child to get up, get down, move around with some of the practical life lessons, then that could be a problem because that defeats some of the purpose of the practical life area, which is the control and coordination of movement. The movement should not be disorderly, but it should help the child have mastery over their body. And so if you're noticing a lot of disorderly movement, you have to take some time to observe and think, okay, why is there not enough controlled movement over this, right? Are you making it too convenient for the child just to stay in one place? So if the child is pouring water, let's say even just the simple pouring water back and forth, do you allow the child to walk over to the sink and fill up their water, go over, pour the water back and forth? And then let's say they're done with that. Let's pour the water out. You can pour it back in the sink, or you could water a plant with that, right? There are other things you can do with water than just dump it down the sink. So we want to conserve our water, and we want to show the child they can do something with it, and then they need to dry off the pitchers and put it back on the shelf for the next person. So are you just filling up the pitchers and that's it? That's all that happens with them during the practical life experience? Are you allowing them to go over to the sink, fill it up, empty them out, dry them off? And this takes walking around the classroom. That gives a little more movement. So just remember that in all your works, there's usually movement. And I know some of you who are trained in AMI are thinking, okay, but there's some where you inhibit movement. And there is an activity in the classroom where we really focus on inhibiting movement, and that is the silence game, which I'll get to in a different video. So wait for that. So if you picked up on what I'm saying here and said, okay, well, there's an inversion to this idea right here, I'm aware of it. We'll make a video on it, I promise. And the other thing is, when it comes to the structure of your lessons, is the child waiting during the lesson, or is the child grabbing at the materials? So if you're letting the child take control of the lesson, This could be a problem too, right? Control and coordination of movement, development of the willpower. The child has to have the willpower to sit and watch the lesson before they touch it. And then sometimes I give a reminder, okay, your hands need to be on your lap until I invite you to have your turn. So when I give these lessons, I don't just let the child usually do that lesson at the same time as me, right? That's not really what we do in Montessori. And I'm trying to think of an exception to that, and I can't think of anything at the moment. So usually I ask the child to wait, to watch, to focus on what I'm doing, to watch my presentation, and then I will invite the child to touch the materials, to have that experience with the materials, but they have to wait first. They have to wait and they have to watch. And that not only develops their inhibition of movement to say, I can control this, but that's the willpower, right? Developing the child's willpower. And that's also going to play into grace and courtesy. Do I have impulse control over my body? So something to keep in mind right there. Number 6, too many toys. And this is something I see a lot of the time in a practical life area. And to be honest, at the beginning of the school year, we usually do put out some toys on the shelf, right? Because the toys at the beginning of the school year are there to help the child adapt. And those are just a placeholder until enough work is introduced that the child can transition out of using those toys and into purposeful work. And so if you're leaving toys on the shelf throughout the entire school year, that's a problem. We really need to get back to getting back to that AMI foundation of they need to be purposeful, right? So the shelves should be filled with work, not toys. And what changes between a toy and work? What changes between play and work? So one, it has to be purposeful for development, right? The child has to be developing his body and taking care of the environment. It has to foster independence. It helps the child adapt, right? So if the toy is helping the child adapt to begin with, that's great, but have a plan for how you're going to transition out of that. Because if you start with that, you start with allowing those toys in and maybe even toys from home, you're going to have to get to a point where you transition out of that. And that can be difficult. And sometimes you just need to have that say of, you know what, sorry, I'm drawing the line. I know it's going to be a hard transition without this toy in the room, but we need to just start on that footing and not go forward, right? Sometimes you have to have those boundaries. And of course, you want to develop the hand for writing, and you need to coordinate movement. So do the toys allow that? Do they allow for the coordination, control and coordination of movement? Does it allow for the development of the hand? And also, does it develop a sense of community, a sense of purpose for the child inside the classroom? Like, what role do I play here in the classroom? So when the child first comes into the classroom and they're in the practical life area, they're there because they're trying to adapt and become independent. But as the child transitions to an older child, they want to have a sense of community. Okay, what's my purpose in this community? How do I give back to this community? How do I function in connection to those who are around me? So just keep that in mind when you're deciding, is this a toy or a work? These are some different tips about figuring out whether or not this is purposeful. And like I said, you can go outside your AMI album for the practical life area. That's not an issue. The issue is deciding whether or not something is a toy or a purposeful work. And another thing I didn't really write on here, but it fits into this category, is fantasy play. Is the child spending too much time during fantasy play with whatever's on the shelf? And if you see that the child is in this fantasy land, then interrupt the child and try to get them into a work that takes them out of the fantasy. And if you're wondering why this is, I have a video on the development of imagination versus fantasy in this age group. So I do have a video on that. I'll put a link to that also in the description below so you can see that. It's one of my first videos, so it may not be the best quality. Maybe I have to redo that video sometime, but it is there. It will give you some sense of why I'm saying the fantasy play is not something you want to see in the 3 to 6 environment. Another thing, 7, too many interruptions. To keep in mind that there are the 3 Ds that you want to look for in the classroom. Disrespectful, disruptive, and dangerous. If you see that happening, you need to stop that. That's when you intervene. Those are your 3 cues as an adult to say, okay, it's my turn to interrupt the child and to and to try and get them into a work or into an environment where they can work, or at least into an environment where they're not disturbing other children who are working. And that is your cue for what the interruptions look like from other children. But what if the interruptions are not coming from children? What if the interruptions are coming from the environment or the adult? So one thing to keep in mind is, are you doing the 3-hour work cycle? So anything that interrupts that 3-hour work cycle is going to interrupt the child's work, and they're not going to be as fulfilled. They're not going to gain those skills. They're not going to be as purposeful. Remember, we're using the scientific method here that Maria Montessori developed. She was very much into that scientific method and that observation, and that's why she developed the 3-hour work cycle. And if you are robbing the child of that 3 full hours of work, then you're becoming an interruption to their work, and they're not going to develop concentration. They're not going to develop to their fullest potential if you interrupt that 3-hour work cycle. And keep in mind that during that 3-hour work cycle, you're going to have something called false fatigue, when it looks like the child is done. They look like they're really not going to go back and concentrate anymore or do anything else purposeful. And Maria Montessori said this is called false fatigue because the child actually just has one more work left in them after this. And you can start seeing it, and it starts out short. And your false fatigue, when it starts coming at the beginning of the year, might be an hour and a half into your work cycle. You have to grow your work cycle, right? It's not just going to happen overnight. You have to build it. And so it might be coming at an hour and a half, until finally it comes about a half an hour to 15 minutes before the end. I would say more half an hour before the end of the 3-hour work cycle. And Maria Montessori said that this is the moment, this false fatigue, once they move past that, and they're going to move past it. The normalized child is going to move past it without the help of an adult. She used to actually leave the room during false fatigue and just walk out so that she wouldn't be tempted to redirect the child during this time. So what it is the child looks like they're getting a little chaotic. They're not going to go back and do purposeful work, but really what they're doing is they're taking that break before they gear up for their biggest work of the day. And if you interrupt them before they get to that biggest work of the day, then you're really taking away a lot of potential growth from the child, a lot of potential development. And so you cannot allow yourself to be an interruption to the child when it comes to that 3-hour work cycle. So when you're thinking about who is interrupting the child, if it's the adult or the children, just keep in mind, if children are being really loud and disrespectful, disruptive, or even dangerous, you have to intervene, right? You absolutely have to intervene. However, if it comes to adults or even administration, right? If they're putting in too many pull-out programs, if they're introducing too many guests into the 3-hour work cycle, if admin is giving you short work cycles, then you need to refocus on the foundations of Montessori and say, listen, we are not serving the child when we're interrupting their 3-hour work cycle, and we need to get back to that. And then the other thing you have to think about is, what do you do with a child who is constantly disrupting others? And children who have ADHD are can be known to be one of those children that interrupt a lot, right? That's pretty typical. And ADHD it's fairly common. You're going to have children in your room with that. And so what is your plan of action for that child, right? Then there are children who just haven't adapted yet, or, a variety of different things that happen, and a lot of reasons why a child might be interrupting other children. They might be screaming because they have a sensorial issue, right? Or they might have a speech issue and they don't know how to communicate their needs, and they might use disruptive behavior instead, right? Or they're just a social little butterfly and they just need to talk to their friends 24/7. That is another thing. So you have to think about, what are your options for leading that child away? Maria Montessori says sometimes you just need to give that child to the assistant and let them go someplace out of the classroom so that the other children can work. And then you have to decide, how are you going to work with this in your environment? And a lot of the time that choice comes down to more administration and not the teacher. So a lot of the times the teacher just tries to do their best. And, you don't always have a choice in that matter. So just try to manage the interruptions you have in your classroom. Number 8, I see sometimes there are teachers who have a fear of mess. And they don't like anything messy. They cannot handle anything messy. And this should not become the child's problem, right? So first of all, understand that third year students need these big works, and big works are often messy. But you should have built up to these big works, right? So that not only are they doing the big works, but they're taking care of it. And that's part of the entire experience, is not just doing the work, but caring for those works. And those collaborative works are important to children who are tipping into that second plane of development. They need that. They need those big collaborative works. They're going to take up space. They're going to make a mess. And you have to plan on that and build up to that and make sure that you have introduced every single skill along the way the child is going to need to do these big works. So every single small skill should be already in place before they go and do these big, huge works. But don't think that they can't do big works, or don't limit them to smaller works. Don't just say, okay, now that you can pour water from pitcher, that's it. You're done in the practical life area, no more, right? Instead, think bigger as far as what they can do. And yes, this does include making a mess. So keep in mind that, as we stated before with plastic versus glass, mess is a type of a control of error. And when you're thinking about messiness, you need to think, okay, what is my trigger here? What really drives me nuts? Is it muddy boots coming in from the outdoor area? Okay, so how are you going to deal with that trigger? What's your response? Do you need to develop a brand new work? Like, okay, how do I develop boot scrubbing for rain boots, right? We have a polishing work in our album, but we don't have a boot scrubbing work for rain boots specifically. So you're going to have to come up with one. And just remember, if an activity gets too big, use smaller dishes, have less access to the materials like paint. Don't put as much out there. Put less yarn on the shelf for sewing. For thread or yarn that gets tangled up, put less out and divide them up if you have to. Separate your sewing work. Sometimes what I've had, particularly at the beginning of the year, is I have a work for just wrapping yarn around a craft stick, and then they measure it out and they wrap it, and that becomes my sewing yarn, right? And so the children who are just learning how to sew don't have to do the big, huge sewing work, and yet I'm not spending my entire day wrapping yarn, right? I incorporate it into a lesson in my classroom so that it feeds into another work, so that the other children are doing the work, developing the hand, still working with the materials, and it's also limiting how much yarn goes on the shelf at one time. So just think about how there can be a controlled and orderly plan for how the child cleans up and how you can put work on the shelf. And this does take time to develop. And usually, we talk about the 3-hour work cycle, but we also talk about the 3-year cycle. And that's why we have multi-age classrooms. I have a 3 to 6 classroom. Why? So that I can build up that 3-year cycle, so that the first couple of years, it's going to be really difficult. It's going to be really difficult. But by the time you get those leaders in, those 3rd-year children in, they're going to know everything. They're going to understand everything, and they're going to be your helpers. They're going to know how to do all these smaller activities, and they're going to be able to work with the younger children. So yes, the first couple of years are going to be on you, and you're going to be putting in a lot of extra work. But at the same time, once you've developed that and you have that in there, those older children are going to be your teachers as well. They're going to run that room for you. So that's going to help a lot. Just remember, it takes a lot of time to develop this, but it does eventually work out. And then again, if the fear of mess is not you, maybe you're a teacher that's like, yeah, I'm all right with mess, doesn't bother me a bit. But you might have a child who is afraid of getting messy, and that does freak them out. And how are you going to respond to that? How are you going to respond to children who never like to get dirty? And my advice there is, you have to respect that. Allow the rest of the children to show the child that being messy is something that first of all, it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? And show them that they have the skills to clean up after that, and that when you are messy, you have a skill, you have the tools necessary to clean it up. And also just understand that that's just how some children are. So keep that in mind, and also keep in mind that might be a reflection of a certain culture or a home environment. So if you try to take that away from the child, when it is a reflection of their home environment and what's familiar, if you try to deviate from that before the child has adapted to the new environment, you might be throwing off the child's sense of order and sense of familiarity, and that might keep them from adapting. So just keep that in mind when it comes to making messes. And fear of noise, and this can apply again to either the teacher or the child. There should be a hum of sound in the classroom. It should not be so quiet you can hear a pin drop. There are some teachers who don't allow any noise in their classroom, and that is not the Montessori way. It shouldn't be chaos, but it should sound like a well-oiled machine. Now, keep in mind, sound is also a control of error in the environment. So this is not something to be avoided, but it does need to be appropriate, and it needs to be in connection to the materials that the child is working with, and it should be purposeful, right? So if you're hearing unusual noises outside of what's in this work, that might be something to keep an eye on. That might be something where you do have to intervene. Also making sure that work is in an area where it might not be distracting to other children is a great idea. However, not everybody has that luxury, right? And so sometimes you have to make compromises based on the environment you're given. So you might want to do a certain activity and you are in a classroom environment where it's nothing but echoes and you have too many sensitive children in the room that are sensitive to sound. So keep in mind there should be works with sound in your room, and some children really need that auditory feedback, that control of error. Of course, there are also some children who need to avoid certain sounds. And learning to accommodate both of these type of children is a very tricky thing. So how will you accommodate the needs for different children? And also, how will you accommodate yourself if you're somebody who doesn't like noise, if you're somebody who really gets drained by certain noises? You do have to make accommodations for that. And maybe outside time on the playground is a better place for you to have some of these noisier activities that are still purposeful. The noise should be purposeful and not chaotic. So just think about what your choices are in your environment, and don't beat yourself up if you don't have an environment that supports every work. I understand that, but do the best you can to accommodate the sounds that come naturally from purposeful work. And not thinking big enough. And this kind of goes back to some things I've already touched on about setting expectations that are correct for each child. Are you being too strict and not allowing enough exploration in the classroom? Remember, the Montessori environment is not a loosey-goosey environment. It's not all crunchy granola, but it's not militaristic either. You should have a beautiful balance between those two extremes. And if you're finding you're going to one extreme or the other, you need to stop. Take a look at what you're doing and find that middle ground. There should be lots of exploration, and you don't underestimate a child. If children aren't doing big works by the time that they're in their third year, you need to build up to it. You need to start with those younger children, those 3-year-olds, build up with the smaller works. And then you have to also say, what are my strengths? Is my strength in woodworking? Is my strength in art? Is my strength in baking? What are these things in my life, is particularly that apply to the practical life area, that I can bring into the classroom and offer? And just how big of a project can I get to by that child's third year? And how do I break that down into smaller steps so the child can achieve that by their third year? So do these children see a bigger goal in their future? And whatever your skills are, maybe it's craft, maybe it is baking, maybe it's food works, but I will admit that food works are probably the number one way to normalize a practical life area. Food. Just keep that in mind. Include as many food works as possible and let the child do everything. by themselves after you present the lesson. Now, I've had carrot peeling in my classroom. Have children gotten cut? Absolutely, they do get cut. Have children gotten cut from a glass breaking in my classroom? Absolutely, they do get cut. Do children get cut chopping a carrot or a pickle? Sure, of course. Do children break eggs for baking and put the entire eggshell into the bread? Absolutely, they do. That happens. These are all part of the child acquiring skills. So you need to look at the potentials for how the child is going to get hurt, limit those potentials, right? But also communicate to parents, we're going to put these works out. Your child is probably going to come home occasionally with a Band-Aid on their finger. Keep that in mind, please. If you're not okay with that, maybe this isn't the best environment for you. Let parents know that we work with breakable things. We do work with sharp things, and we do limit that control of error when it comes to sharp things. We go to different places, like Montessori Services has a lot of child size type materials that really limit how a child can get hurt, but it's still not impossible, right? We want to do everything as carefully as possible and also allow the child to be as exploratory as possible at the same time. So you have to find that middle ground between what's safe and what's exploratory. And keep in mind, sometimes the food is not going to turn out. It's not going to be edible. And I understand if you don't want to offer it to other children in the classroom, even though we want to involve grace and courtesy, right? We really want the children to be serving other children. But keep in mind, this is a great idea, also a great time, a great way to incorporate animals into your classroom. So at one of the schools I worked at, we had a farm school. We had chickens there. And when things didn't turn out, we went and we fed the chickens. And during COVID, I could not let the children eat any of the food that they prepped, but I really, really insisted on food preparation. It has to be in my classroom. It is something children absolutely need. It's going to calm children, and especially deviated children who can't adapt. They usually do really well in the food area. So that's something to keep in mind. So feeding the chickens became a way for us to do food work and not eat it during COVID. So think outside the box, try to incorporate food work even if you can't eat it. At least you're serving somebody, or at least we're serving the chickens, right? That's a good first step. And keep in mind, take a look at that picture at the top of the child watching the parent or the adult chop some vegetables. Now, it's really great for the child to observe, and that child looks like they're concentrating. That's great. That's what we want to see. But also just keep in mind, if you are putting more effort into the work than the child is, it's not a very good lesson. So just keep that in mind. The child should be able to experience it. And if it takes more time for you to do the lesson than the child, and I don't mean as far as the first presentation goes. What I mean is, in order to accomplish this lesson, if the child is dependent on you to finish this work, to finish this lesson, then they put effort into it, then it's not a good lesson. And usually these experiences come when we're doing gifts for parents, like Mother's Day and Christmas, usually any of those things. It's usually the teacher who does most of the work for those things, and the child just does a quick little something or another, like a thumbprint or something like that, right? And so we do have some of those works in the Montessori environment, but those are not ideally the works you want to have on a regular basis. Those are once in a while throughout the year type of experiences. So just remember, the child should watch you give the presentation, and then they should be able to do it. So a child should be able to chop their own carrots in the 3 to 6 environment. And not only in the 3 to 6 environment, if you go to watch an AMI toddler classroom, they are also chopping carrots. They're baking bread. They're chopping pickles, all that stuff. So it's not just the 3 to 6 environment. They're doing this in the toddlers. So just remember that children are really capable of doing a lot more than you might expect. But you have to build up to it. You have to take it slow. You have to put all those skills separately in small doses and then put it together. So just keep that in mind of think big in the practical life area. Give the child vision for what they're working towards, and that gives them motivation. What is the bigger goal that they want to work towards in their third year in the classroom? And the last one, 11, forgetting the purpose. So we want to remember the purpose for practical life. And here are several purposes of practical life, the main ones anyways. First one is to adapt to the environment. This is a place where the child adapts. They've come from the home environment, they've gotten into the classroom, it's kind of scary. How are they going to adapt? They're going to look for things that are familiar. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Second thing is grace and courtesy. How are they treating other children in the classroom? Do you have lesson presentations for how to treat each other in the classroom? Are you seeing a pattern of behavior that's developing in the classroom that is very rude or that isn't in the grace and courtesy ideal for the environment? Then you need to create a lesson plan for how to have more grace and courtesy with each other. And also remember that a big purpose of the practical life area is control and coordination of movement. Incorporating movement, the child should be moving. They should be developing the hand for writing. They should be becoming more independent. Everything they're learning in the practical life area is going to give them more independence. It's going to allow them to take better care of themselves and care of the environment, people and things around them. So that independence needs to be growing. And remember, practical life area it's an exploratory area. It brings the child from a smaller environment into a larger world. And so everything we're doing, we're going to start small and familiar, and they're going to move towards this bigger world that they're a part of. And we should be exploring culture through this environment, through this particular area, but we do want to start out with that familiar first. So keep those things in mind. Those are the 11 biggest mistakes that I've seen in the practical area. But if you have something that I've missed, please leave it in the comment section below. I'd love to hear what you see in the practical life area that you think, okay, this is where sometimes we make some mistakes. So feel free to add to the list down below in the comment section. And of course, if you like what I'm doing here, hit the like button. So like, share, comment, and if you could, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you in the next video.